So Ruth chapter 3. I find myself this week really lacking rest. Boys are chuckling because they know I've been up with kiddies. Not least because of that, because of a kind of snotty-nosed, pukey at one point baby. But just generally, lacking rest. And it seems to me that that's not something unique to me, especially this week. I think this week's been living evidence. We live in a world where it just seems to be one thing after another, doesn't it? Get over one thing, something else kind of comes out of nowhere. Months and months of COVID looked like it was coming to a bit of an end, bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe restrictions all going to be wiped away. And then what happened? Outbreak of war in Europe in a way that we thought we would never probably see in our lifetimes. All of it played out in full colour HD on our TV screens every single minute of every single day if you want to watch it. All these pictures just reminding us that there really is nothing new under the sun. So people living in Ukraine right now, surrounded by gunfire, surrounded by explosions, they know way more acutely than me what it is to lack rest. Rest in short supply in our world. Humanity is the same. This world ultimately hasn't changed. And sometimes, though temporary respite does come, life under this sun, on this earth, feels most of the time much more like struggle after struggle after struggle. For loads of us in this room, survival and success will only come on the back of really, really hard work or the stress of living on the wrong side of the law. Sleep with one eye open. As age starts to take hold of all of us, I turned 30 this year. Would you believe that? As age starts to take hold, health gets harder to hold on to, doesn't it? Relationships in our lives strain, people pass away, we experience pain, we fail to live as we want to live, we sin, and people sin against us. And we find ourselves, if you're anything like me, just kind of groaning all so often, I am so tired. It is one thing after another. I'm weary. That was the experience of Naomi in Ruth chapter 1. As she followed her husband away from God in search of food, only to then put her husband and her two boys in the ground in a land far from home. There was one bad thing after another. That's what we saw. They left the land of promise because of empty bellies, and Naomi is brought back to Bethlehem saying, I am now empty of anything. The question was, what's she going to find when she gets home? What will Bethlehem hold for Naomi? Will there be any respite? Will there even be rest? Of course, she didn't arrive back in Bethlehem alone. She had this Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth, by her side. Ruth left her home in Moab, even though Naomi tried to send her back. Chapter 1, verse 9, she tried to say, go back, find rest in the home of another husband. But Ruth clung to Naomi, didn't she? She clung to her in love. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Where you go, I'll go. Ruth loves Naomi, and so she wants to live with her. But for Ruth, to live with Naomi is going to make life really limited for Ruth. She's now a Moabite in a foreign land, committing herself wholeheartedly to finding favour under the wings of the God of Israel, not her people. And so what we asked last week in chapter 2 was, can a foreigner find favour? What will Bethlehem hold for Naomi, but what's Bethlehem going to hold for Ruth? And then we saw that Ruth just happened to find herself in the field of a man. Of course, we know it was God who caused Boaz to enter the picture. The whole of chapter 2 took place in the daytime as light entered into the dark, bitter experience of these two widows. In the field of Boaz, the foreigner does find favour. That's what happens. Vulnerable Ruth receives protection, receives provision from this man of noble character. In chapter 2, Boaz is on display. Boaz shines off the pages of chapter 2 as a man who embodies the loving kindness of God. He gives her food from his harvest, he protects her while she works in his fields, and he goes above and beyond what the law requires. He does what is right. Respite enters this tragedy of a story that we've entered into. The bitterness of death is just going to put on pause for a time. But then we get to the end of chapter 2. So if you've got your Bible, have a look there with me. The end of chapter 2, verse 23. It says, Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. It's a little bit of an anticlimax. Don't know whether you noticed that last week. Feels a little bit anticlimactic. Sure, food has been secured for the time being. That's part of the kind of jigsaw of need that's been put in place. But these women are still lacking. They lack family. They've got no offspring. Naomi's husband dead. Ruth's husband dead. Ruth's womb barren. Both of them widows. Their line stops with them. The name of their dead husbands ends now, lost from the people of God. In fact, more likely going down in history as a family cursed. Not only do they not have family, but the favour that they've found so far was found in Boaz's fields. Now harvest is finished. The field is soon to be forgotten, protection and provision now no longer guaranteed. And these two women are just sort of left as this odd couple of widows living together, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. The favour that they found was in the fields. There was a pause in the relentlessness of their tragedy, but it was just a pause. The question now is, how will temporary respite turn into lasting rest? Where will protection and provision be found now that harvest is over? And what we find in chapter 3 is that these two women pursue what God has presented to them in chapter 2. God has brought them back to the place of blessing. He's shown them loving kindness in doing that. He's spread his wings of refuge around them, as we thought last week. And then he's turned them to see, standing in the spotlight, this man called Boaz. The harvest is over, but God in his care has made very clear to these women where the blessing of rest is to be found for them. This man Boaz. And so what we find here is Ruth and Naomi planning and working and waiting, all under the wings of God. In this chapter, they are both in pursuit of what has been presented to them in chapter 2. So, verse 1 of Ruth chapter 3, we got there. Verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for." Now, Boaz, with whose women you've worked, is a relative of ours. Here's the first scene. Planning under the wings of God. Now what we've got here in these first couple of verses is the kind of slightly awkward matchmaking of a mother-in-law for her widowed daughter-in-law. Ruth, I need to find a home for you. The word there is rest. Ruth, I need to find rest for you. What about Boaz? He's the one who's shown favour to you already. He's the one who's provided food and protection already. Most important of all, verse 2, he's a relative of ours. Now, again, if you've got your Bible, flip back a few verses into chapter 2 and verse 20, because this isn't the first time Naomi has pointed out that Boaz is a relative. He's part of the extended family. Verse 20. For a moment here, Naomi's sad eyes that have experienced a whole lot of bitterness just have a little glint in them. That man is our close relative, she said. He's one of our guardian redeemers. Now, we need a little bit of context here, because guardian redeemers to us sounds like something out of a superhero film. or something like that. Here's the basic situation in ancient Israel. God has given laws to his people to govern how they should live. And not few of them are there to ensure the care and protection of the weak and the vulnerable. People like widows, people like orphans, people like foreigners are important to God. And in God's law, there were instructions for caring for the family left behind by an Israelite man who died without heirs. Their property was to be purchased. It was to be bought back. The word is redeemed, in order to then provide for their remaining family. If widows were left without any offspring, it was pressing on wider family members that somebody should then marry that widow and raise children by her on behalf of the man who has died, preserving his name, preserving his line, providing for the dead man's family that has been left. This was a costly activity. It was part of God showing his care, his caring character, as the God who has already spread his wings around these two widows. Now, Boaz, we find, is a man specially positioned to be one of these guardian redeemers for these two widows. He's already provided foods. He can also, though, provide the family they still so lack. And so Naomi comes up with a plan. Verse 2. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know that you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Here's the thing to do, says Naomi. Get yourself cleaned up. Wash off the muck and the dust of the day. Get your best clothes on. Get some perfume on. This isn't just a usual Friday night that Naomi's describing. This is something special. Now, don't imagine Ruth's clothes, Ruth's best clothes, being something sort of revealing and racy. Don't imagine that for a second. It'd be really easy to mistake Naomi's plan for something unsuitable and something unwholesome. But Naomi's not here sending her daughter-in-law, who she loves, off dressed up as some sort of piece of meat. She's sending Ruth away, not as a Moabite with a plan to seduce, but as a bride with a proposal. A bride with a proposal. Here's the plan. Go. Pursue what God has presented. And Ruth answers, verse 5, I will do whatever you say. Now, please don't miss the love, the mutual love between these two women that we see in these verses. From the very beginning, Naomi's desire for Ruth is that she find rest in a home. That's what she wants for her. And she sees in Boaz a man who can provide that for Ruth. Ruth's desire is not to escape her sort of overbearing mother-in-law. Ruth's desire is, I will go with whatever man you send me to, if he is the one who is going to be able to provide for you. This is the man who's going to be able to redeem Naomi's sad situation. It's mutual loving kindness on display. But we can't help but notice, and there were a couple of giggles, we can't help but notice that what Naomi tells Ruth to do does look at first glance to be a little bit sketchy. It does. Get cleaned up. Go and uncover his legs. Lie down. So it's really important to say, especially for the immature boys smirking away, no fingers pointed. It's really important to say, this is not dating advice. This isn't dating advice. Certainly not. But the instruction to lie down actually does get us really close to the heart of what this plan is driving at as Naomi comes up with it. The phrase lie down is used 8 times in this chapter. This is a plan to pursue what is needed for these two childless widows. Lie down, rest. Lie down, reproduction. That's what's being spoken about. A home for Ruth and hope for Naomi. Both of these things come together and find their answer in Boaz, the one that God has presented to them. Now some action is needed on their part. The harvest is over. There's no wedding in the offing yet. Boaz has been kind, but there's nothing more in the pipeline, really. And so we see in Naomi's plan that pursuing what God has presented must be something deliberate. God had presented the possibility of rest and blessing. These women were now responsible for pursuing that. So that, I think, has something to say to us this morning if we're Christians. But it also has something to say to us if we're not Christians. If you're here this morning not trusting in Christ, God has revealed that the way to rest and the way to blessing is found in his Son, Jesus Christ. And God has shown his loving kindness to you in bringing you along to church this morning, to hear the gospel, to hear about Jesus. God has shown his loving kindness in presenting Jesus before you as the only way to life and blessing and real lasting rest. The responsibility now lies with you to pursue him. How will you respond to what's been presented to you? The question is, will you kind of make do and content yourself with the half blessing of hearing? Will you say, that's enough for me? Maybe come along, enjoy a wee cup of tea and a biscuit, enjoy the friendships that you make with other people as you come along to church. Maybe even enjoy the comfort that it brings you to know that you're now a church-going person, you've got some morals, you do some good things. Will you decide that these temporary things are all that you need, when what's presented before you in Jesus Christ is vast and lasting blessing and full and final rest? That response would continue the tragedy. And if you're a Christian this morning, the question for you is, how are you pursuing the blessing and the rest that God has presented you with? Naomi and Ruth lived in the real world, where real practical provision of a guardian redeemer was what they needed to pursue. And you and I live in a very real world, do we not? And God has made plain to us what very practical provision he has put in place where we can find blessing and rest. Under his wings, he's given us a plan. These are practical, outward things through which God has said he will do lasting inward work in us. Bible, baptism into the membership of a local church, the Lord's Supper, prayer. There's nothing new about these things. They are, though, plain. These are what God has revealed. These are the means through which God works and anxiousness is removed, peace is applied, troubles are taken away, endurance is provided, temptation is overcome. God has plainly presented these things to us as the means of blessing and the route to rest, maybe even especially in the chaos of life. But you must plan to pursue them. It must be deliberate. We do not fall into these things. In fact, we more often than not fall out of these things. And so we must plan to pursue them. Verse 6. So, she, that's Ruth, went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Ruth gets to work. This is the second scene. We see her working now under the wings of God. Let's keep reading. Verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now, down at the threshing floor, Boaz and his men are tired after a hard day's work of processing the grain that they've harvested. They've had a meal, and now they're settling in for the night to protect their hard-earned harvest from getting nicked. Now, while everything in chapter 2 took place in the day, chapter 3 is definitively at night. And as Ruth comes, she comes under cover of darkness, quietly. She's taken a risk. These are the days of the judges, we said. These are days when for a woman to be out on her own is dangerous. For a woman to be out on her own after dark, even more so. And here's Ruth, the only woman in this scene, the only woman at this threshing floor, a Moabite. She comes to a place where a bunch of Judges-era men are gathered. Risky. And she stakes everything here on the basis of what she's seen of the character of Boaz and the fact that she believes the risk is worth it. Pursuing what God has presented often involves risk. Leaving short-term security to pursue lasting rest. Often, though, self-preservation can keep us from pursuing the salvation and the blessing that God has offered. We don't want to take the risk of ridicule from people who see us following Jesus. We fear Jesus might change my life too much when I'm already kind of semi-comfortable. Coming to Jesus in acceptance of our need for a Redeemer means lowering our guard. It means being open. It means being honest. It means no more putting up a front. It's risky. I don't want to get taken advantage of. But I want to say to you this morning that what might feel like a leap in the dark is actually a response to what's been clearly seen in the day. It's not blind faith. It's taking action to come near the Redeemer. It's worth the risk. And as Ruth comes, she waits. And she waits. She waits until Boaz has fallen asleep. And then quietly, unseen, she approaches him and him alone. This is a deeply personal scene. She approaches under the cover of darkness, not in scandal, but in secret. Because there's something between her and Boaz that needs to be worked out. No one else. In the chapter before, Boaz had singled Ruth out in his fields in order to show her special kindness. Now, this is a personal pursuit by Ruth of that personal Redeemer. And it has to be said this morning that for you and me, if you're a believer, relationship with our Redeemer must be personal. For all of us in this room, our response to what we've seen of the love of Jesus comes down to him and me. There is a general offer that the gospel makes. There is a guardian Redeemer who Ruth has come to know. The provision of God for the needy and helpless. But that public offer must be applied personally. One at a time. You have to come to our Redeemer and ask him to be your Redeemer. It must be personal. The scene that we find here on the threshing floor is almost so personal it feels a little bit uncomfortable looking in. Verse 8. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. Maybe a breeze on his legs had been uncovered. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. Now, I don't know what you're like when you've been woken up in the middle of the night unexpectedly. I don't know what kind of "who are you" this was that came out of Boaz's mouth. He's startled. "Who are you?" In chapter 2, Boaz had asked this question to his servants about this woman. Who is that woman? But now it's personal. Who are you? And here's what I think Ruth would have replied last week. Well, I'm Ruth the Moabite. I'm the Moabitess from Moab. Last week we find she was just a foreigner in a field. But look at what she says, verse 9. "I am your servant, Ruth." Moab is never mentioned in this chapter. Not once. Moab is behind her. Ruth's looking forward. And what's in front of her is Boaz. She's pledged herself to the God of Israel in chapter 1. She's come under the refuge of the wings of this Lord in chapter 2. She no longer sees herself as a Moabitess. Last week, a foreigner found favour. Now a servant pursues what's being presented. She's part of Boaz's clan, she's saying. And maybe you need to hear that this morning. Maybe you need to hear that the answer to who are you does not have to be defined by something in your past. Maybe you need to hear that when you're asked the question, who are you, the answer doesn't have to be addict. The answer doesn't have to be angry. The answer doesn't have to be nothing. The answer doesn't have to be sinner. If you've come under the wings of refuge of this God of Israel, the answer that you give can be servant of God, part of his people. As we're going to see in a little while, daughter, son. And Ruth's new identity here causes her to be bold, really bold. Look at what she says. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. This goes further than the plan that Naomi laid out for Ruth. Ruth just blurts it all out. This is a bold pursuit based on the promises of God and the character of the Redeemer. Ruth doesn't leave any ambiguity here. She doesn't leave her actions open to misinterpretation. This is what I'm about, she says. So let me be really clear. Nothing inappropriate happens in this scene. What we have here isn't shady relations, but it is heavy with the possibility of intimacy. It's like Boaz's words in chapter 2 are coming back to bite him a little bit. He said to Ruth, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And here comes Ruth. Boaz, here I am. I've come to be richly rewarded. Guess what? You're the reward. I've come to stake my claim. You're the guardian redeemer. God has provided you. It's not just Ruth's good idea. This is based on the provision of God for her very situation. The provision of a redeemer for the weak and for the needy. So spread the corner of your garment over me, she says. Now that sounds weird again. But in ancient Israel, these words were full of meaning. Ruth, the widow here, is dressed up for a wedding. And this is a marriage proposal. So it can be the woman. It's not a problem. This language has echoes of how God speaks about wedding himself to his people. It's filled with the potential of marital intimacy. And I need to take you here, because this was helpful this week. Ezekiel chapter 16, elsewhere in the Old Testament. This is how God describes his relationship with his people, with Israel. Listen to this. On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. No one looked on you with pity, or had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day you were born, you were despised. Picture it. It's a baby, brand new, chucked away. Good for nothing. Then, says God, I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood. And as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. I made you grow like a plant of the field. You grew and developed and entered puberty. Your breasts had formed and your hair had grown. Yet you were stark naked. Later I passed by. And when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. The love of God for his people isn't the kind of locking eyes across a dance floor, instant physical attraction kind of love. It's not like that. God saw something needy. God saw something helpless. God saw something vulnerable. He saw something naked, and he wrapped his wings of refuge around them. The language is the same in chapter 2 and chapter 3. The spreading of the garment and the wrapping of the wings, it's the same word. This was something despised in the eyes of others, and God wedded himself to them. Ruth is here at Boaz's feet, no better than a Moabite in the eyes of most people around them. No more than a servant in her own words. As if she is naked and helpless and needing to be covered. This is no small thing. And what she's asking is actually going to be really costly to Boaz. Here's an upright man, we're told, awakened in the middle of the night to find that his legs have been uncovered by a foreign woman. To be uncovered like this was a shameful thing. Now she's going to ask him to marry her, a Moabite. What are people going to think? A Moabite is shameful. For Boaz to be her guardian redeemer is going to be costly. And here in this scene, we are supposed to see, leaping off the pages, a stunning picture of the relationship between Jesus and his people. People who find ourselves nakedly sinful, helplessly uncovered. We try and try, don't we, to hide our sin. We try to cover our sin, but we can't do it. It's on display. It's a reminder of who we are. And then, in this picture, turn and look at Jesus, a Redeemer, hanging on the cross uncovered, stark naked on a tree, ridiculed and shamed by passers-by, joining himself by that death to people no better than naked sinners, no better than Moabites, embracing all of the shame of uncovered association with sin and with sinners in order to cover his people with his sinless blood. So that when God looks on me, do you know what? He doesn't see my naked sinfulness. He sees the perfection of Jesus that covers me. Jesus is the friend of sinners who covers our sin. The question in our story, though, is how will Boaz respond? Will he scold her? She's been bold. Away you go! You're a servant. How dare you speak to me, a master? Get away from me. You're a youth. The nerve of speaking to me, your elder, like that. Get off my threshing floor. You're a Moabitess. How can you even come to my threshing floor when I'm an Israelite? Verse 10. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. That's a good start. Relief. He's at least going to be gentle. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I'll do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you're a woman of noble character. And we're supposed to cheer. Yes! This is what we've been hoping for on Ruth's behalf. It's all coming together. There seems to be a bit of an age gap. But he describes her as a woman of noble character. That lines up perfectly with what we read of him in chapter 2, verse 1. They might not be that physically compatible, we've no idea. But guess what? They match really well in who they are. Ruth's commitment to pursuing him as guardian redeemer for the sake of Naomi really impresses him. And the answer comes, I will do for you all that you ask. He's a willing redeemer. Verse 12. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer for our family, there is another who's more closely related than I. No! That's not what we wanted to hear here. It's not what we wanted. It was all going so well. And now suddenly, relationship status, complicated. Perhaps Boaz isn't the man after all. Verse 13. Stay here for the night, he says to her. And in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Ruth has now done all that she can. She has tried. She has moved forward. The home where she could finally rest, it seemed in reach. But then there's a complication she didn't see coming. It's all going so well. Maybe you know what that feels like. I was so sure. So sure. It's almost painful, isn't it? And with this big question mark hanging in the air at this point, verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. Doesn't want shame attached to this woman. He also said, bring me the shawl that you're wearing and hold it out. And when she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. I can't imagine huge amounts of rest we had this night, can you? Lying there under the stars. Am I engaged? Is there going to be a wedding? What's this other guy going to say? What's tomorrow going to hold? But Ruth's work is done at this point. All that's left to do is wait. And that's the last scene we see in chapter 3. Waiting under the wings of God. Verse 16. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law Naomi, asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. It's another little awkward interaction between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, isn't it? How did it go? How did it go? But they're in this together. It's time to wait. Ruth is not pregnant yet, but chapter 3 is pregnant with possibility and hope. Question marks remain, but it's time to wait. There's one final episode in this story to go. Ruth comes back to Naomi, who in chapter 1 declared, the Lord has brought me back empty. And here's Ruth, not empty-handed, but with months' worth of food. Don't go back empty, Boaz had said. Naomi's no longer empty, but what they have is 6 measures. This is a little detail, but I think it's really helpful. In the Bible, the number for completeness is 7. I almost couldn't count there. 7. The number of complete perfection is 7. They have 6 measures. What they have is incomplete. There's more to come. No longer empty, but not yet quite full. She's back home to Naomi. She's not yet in the home of Boaz. Wait, my daughter. We've seen who this man is. The character of that Redeemer gives us confidence of the partial rest being made full. The man won't rest till the matter is settled today. Wait. Now, we aren't waiting for Boaz today, but we are waiting. And we are waiting for rest. And if you're not a Christian, let me make it so clear. You're waiting for rest that isn't coming. You stand instead condemned and shamed with all of your sin nakedly on display. What you're waiting for isn't rest. It's an eternity of unrelenting judgment for your sin. What you need is to be covered by Jesus. What you need is to recognize God's provision. What you need is to come to Him personally and ask Him to make you His. And in Jesus, there is a Redeemer who will always, always answer, I will. And if you are a Christian this morning, then we wait. We wait for the completion of what's been begun. We wait for rest from what continues to weary us. Though today, feeling overwhelmed and feeling like the world shifts beneath our feet, harassed and shaken and stressed and tired and sad, in Jesus we have a Redeemer who will not rest until His people are fully and finally welcomed home. Wait. At the end of chapter 3, we're left expectant as to what's to come. What God has plainly presented has now been pursued. And now it's time to wait for the Redeemer to bring about that long-awaited rest. We've got one episode to go in the book of Ruth. And this is God's word to us.